Why does it take a minute?
It's the delay from the streaming service onto YouTube. It's a little behind. It means we can censor your language. It doesn't mean that at all. Definitely not that sophisticated. I'll leave that back to introduce. Oh, thank you very much.
Great, thank you.
Here we go. Right. So, hi. Hello on Zoom. Hello on YouTube. Thank you for being here. It's a huge pleasure for me to be able to welcome Robin Mackie and Mark Fell. Robin Mackie is a writer, a philosopher, and the director of Urbanomic. And Urbanomic is the press that has published Mark's book. I think Robin is also uniquely placed to have this conversation not only as the publisher, but as someone who's written extensively and collaborated with musical artists and other artists. Mark Fell is the recently appointed International Visiting Artist in Sound Art in association with the School of Composition and the Prison, at the Centre for Practice, Research and Science of Music. And so we'll be making various visits to the RNCM to make work and work with students. He is obviously an international artist, musical artist, music producer, and sound artist of great stature. And it's a pleasure to both here to hear a bit about Mark. I think that's everything from me. Sure. Thanks.
Am I supposed to clap then? Because we're clapping you leaving.
Yes, it's your
I think it's question and answer, so it starts with a question.
Yeah, so we worked on this book for a long time together, and I've been listening to Mark's work for many years before that. And it's been really interesting that Mark's very generous in talking about how he makes music and the reflections that come from his practice. But I suppose one initial question would be, why write? Famously, I think someone said, writing about music is like dancing without architecture, which sounds like a really interesting practice. But given that we often think of music or art in general as being able to do something that words can't, why did you feel it was important to begin writing?
Because other people had written about music, and I disagreed with them. So yeah, that was it.
Yeah.
Also, I guess I enjoy writing. I thought I enjoyed writing until I started doing the book, and then it started off kind of quite easy, and then became quite brutal. But yeah, I guess I had things I wanted to say. I had a position on things, and I wanted to. It kind of felt like I was writing a book for someone in the second year of university who was having a bad time, and this would sort them out. Do you know what I mean? Yeah, so I guess that wasn't the motivation, but.
So did you have positions on music, theories about music, and then start making music? Or did you make music and then saw what other people were writing and thought, that's not what I'm doing?
Well, it would be impossible not to have beliefs about music before you start doing it. But the beliefs didn't feel important when I started doing music. Is that I don't think of anything else to. Yeah, I mean, yeah.
So you found that what you actually did when you started making music was somehow detached or separate from any ideas you might have about what music was.
No, that's not what I said. Clearly, even though I was not consciously aware of these are the beliefs that kind of form the context, it's not like it was outside that context. But I guess I became more interested in looking at that context once I got to college and realised that I was disagreeing with everyone there.
What kind of things were you disagreeing with?
a musical instrument, or that there wasn't any kind of tension between me, you know, it wasn't like a tug of war between me and the technology in the production of music, you know. So yeah, just, I guess I was kind of like a stressed out, angry kid. And angry about everything, I guess. I mean, it's not surprising I was kind of angry about everything, given what I was living through and stuff.
And did music provide a way out of that, or did it just make you angry about different things?
Music was part of like an alternative world, you know, so I was like, I encountered philosophy, film, literature, music, and it was like, not that I had a particularly bad up, you know, I had great parents and stuff and really supportive, but you know, it was like I was interested in a different world, and I guess that's what, and music was part of that world, you know, a world of weird ideas and, you know, strange places and people and stuff. Yeah, as well as being really into music, you know, listening to electronic music was always really good fun.
So you mentioned drum machines. Did you have any kind of apprenticeship in music, or did you play any other instruments? Or did you just kind of go straight to playing electronic?
There is a bit of a sort of secret that I will now reveal, that when I was at school, I did learn to play guitar, and absolutely hated it completely. I hated the guitar teacher, I hated carrying the guitar to school. Also, I just hated, I hated everything about it. I hated the performing it. I was like always asked to do solos and stuff. Not that I was very good, but you know, it was like I was the best of a bad bunch, I guess. And I remember it's really weird, I kind of had this dream. I don't know if this is in the book, but I had this dream that I was like in some alternate reality. And I looked down at my guitar and it was all square shaped. And then from that day, I mean, it must have been about 5 years later or something, I got a drum machine, but I said, right, I'm not playing the guitar anymore. And then got a drum machine.
Until it gets quantized.
Yeah, quantized guitar. No, I just hated it.
Can you define what it is that immediately kind of got you on board and enthusiastic when you got a drum machine that had not been there with the guitar? What were like the qualities of the instrument?
Well, I'd already got into electronic music, you know, so I was already listening to like synthesizer stuff, and I guess for me what I liked about the drum machine was just, here's a thing that you can, you know, like, it's a very simple systematic object, and you can play with it, you know, like any other, like a Rubik's Cube or something. So I guess that was it.
That's the thing that comes up regularly in the book, is the kind of advocacy of what you call JTK, isn't it? Just turning knobs.
Yeah, well, there's a bit of a joke that, because this is a quote from DJ Pierre when he talks about when they first made Acid House, and he did this thing. He said, I was just turning knobs, and what I did in the glossary, I kind of like decided to like go really over the top and do like consider different types of just turning knobs. So I think there's about 5 different sorts of just turning knobs, which relate to my experience of just turning knobs. You know, like sometimes you're turning a knob and you're looking for something, and then you found it and you're hovering on it. You know, so it's the phenomenology of just turning knobs. Yeah.
But there's something that there's a profound commitment, I feel, in your practice to an approach to music that isn't to do with having a score and moving through the score from beginning to end, but it's about, in some sense, being in the middle of the music.
Well, I realised, so I kind of grew up using drum machines and analog synths, and then MIDI came along, and the dream was to get a digital audio, at that time not a digital audio workstation, but something like Cubase, which was the timeline system. And so I sold a few analog synths that I got an Atari ST, got the bootleg version of Cubase, and then realised I couldn't actually make music anymore. Like, it just didn't work, It's like everything I did sounded absolutely terrible. And years later, I realised it was because it put me in a certain relationship to the musical materials, that didn't work for me. And
what's the relationship with that?
That you're kind of pressing stop and fast forward and rewind and writing some stuff in. Basically, very traditional composition, in terms of like how I would imagine it is if you have a piece of paper and you're writing events on it. And it wasn't that I didn't enjoy it, because I was quite happy about going through the pain barrier to make work. It's just that everything I made on it sounded terrible. Like thank God I never released any of that. But it was, so that was the issue. And so for me personally, I'm not interested in that way of making music. And I'm kind of quite hostile to the belief that that is fundamentally what music making is. If you look at people who make these technologies, they'll say this, you can do anything in this platform, and of course you can, but you don't, because you are placed in a very specific relationship to it, if you see what I mean. If you look at like a lot of electronic dance music now, for example, you can see the layering of things and things dropping out, and it's not, for me, it's not a problem that they're products of the environment. The problem is the belief that it's a completely transparent system.
Right, but it's a neutral, a neutral canvas that you can draw on. In fact, it's like a set of latent constraints that push you in a certain direction.
Well, there's a process, and it's not in any way open. It's like incredibly fixed in terms of you are in this relationship to the materials.
Are any technologies any less constraining, or are they just constraining in different ways?
I'm not after finding a utopian piece of equipment that is like free of constraints. I'm about using equipment and exploring the character of that equipment. If you see what I mean.
And what do you find is conducive to your way of working with the software that you use now? Is it the same thing that you found was?
Also, I think that's really what I just said about I'm into picking up technology. I think that is the most traditional form of music making. I think that's what people do. That's what people have historically done. So I'm not saying like, look at me, I'm doing this special thing. I'm actually like ultra conservative in that respect, I think. What was your name? The bit that I just cut you off.
What is it about the software that you use, the processes you use now, that is conducive to music making, the way you do it?
Well, the primary tool that I use is Max MSP, and it's a really simple answer that you can build systems in it and mess about with the systems.
So your music generally sounds, I would say it sounds controlled. It sounds like there's a kind of rigorous patterning going on. But when you're making music, you're actually still just turning knobs in some sense.
Yeah, I mean,
to like describe something.
Yeah, like you could say I'm just sort of fiddling around. Like I had this kind of discussion with someone in an online seminar or workshop a year or so ago, where I said, basically when I make music, I'm just exploring what the thing does. And this guy was like, well, so you're just playing then? And I was like, well, you could call it that, but if I was a scientist exploring the interaction of these things, you wouldn't say I was playing, And the more I thought about it, the more I actually ended up thinking, what I'm what I'm doing here is much more like what someone might do. It's very similar to the kinds of activities that you associate with scientific exploration, you know, like you refine, you simplify things and have a background of stuff that is concrete in order to focus on the bits that you want to explore. And also, I'm not saying that because I think let's elevate it to the level of science to give it more credibility or whatever. But I just think there's a commonality there that, as I said in the book, that it's driven by curiosity about how things behave.
But the things that you're exploring are systems that you built yourself, right? So you're building the tool and then you're exploring what you can do.
Yeah, but I think even to say you're building the tool and exploring what it can do frames it in a kind of, in terms of a means-end continuum, you know what I mean? That there's a thing called a tool and there's the outcome that is the reason for the tool being and stuff. But really, that's not what it feels like, you know. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but how does it feel?
It feels like I'm just messing around with these things and enjoying it. Usually, that's what it feels like.
Can you point to any piece that you've made where you kind of had a realization about what it was that you were trying to do? They're kind of like hinge moments where your practice kind of moved on.
I think there are moments that, like, where I kind of made sort of breakthroughs, I guess. So like the early stuff I did when I was making house music and techno, and I was using Cubase, and it was awful, like awful music, the worst.
Gain issue. Just ignore me. Sorry.
What's going on?
Just trying to get the gain up. Some comments on YouTube, so sorry for the interruption.
He's a bit dim, this guy. What was I going to say? I forgot where I was at. Oh yeah, so I was making like really bad house and techno, and in a timeline environment, and really upset about it actually, because I guess for like 5 years I was just kept making really bad music, and had this horrible feeling of like what's going on. And then what happened was I encountered some other music, so like people like Mike King and Thomas Brinkman and the Basics Channel stuff from Berlin, or Germany, I guess, Berlin, which was kind of techno but extremely linear. You know, there was no kind of, it's not like now we introduce this loop and now there's a vocal sample and now we have this dropout and There was none of that, it's just this thing that carried on. And suddenly I thought, yeah, that is what I need to do. So I just build loops for things that just with no change basically. And like on the first album I made, the actual, like all that happens between track 1 and track 2 is the same track but with just a different sound, but you know, an extra percussion sound or something, or a really minor shift in the loop length or something. So that was a really big thing for me. It was like I can forget these habits and these things that I think I should be doing about, you know, there's this build up of energy and all this stuff. Forget that and just reduce it to this thing, and it just seemed to work.
Was there like a sadness in that movement as well, that like you weren't producing music for a club or for like people to dance to? You were moving into a different context.
But I thought I was actually making house music, like proper, and then we got it back, and it's like, oh, this doesn't sound like that record. You know, it's like, so until we got it on the record player, we didn't realise.
You became experimental by accident.
Yeah, but like there wasn't a sadness about leaving that world behind, because you know I kind of grew up in that house and techno world, but after about 6 months going out to clubs and seeing everyone just the carnage of drug use, that was just like, I'd had enough of it, you know. It was like I was the guy at the side of the wall going, let's go home, you know, it's 12 and I want to get in bed. So it's like it was, and also around 92 is like maybe 91 is when house and techno shifted from being, you know, peripheral activity to everyone getting into it. I mean, obviously about 87 there was acid house, which was, you know, massive in the charts and stuff, but I think really by 91 it's like everyone, it was like a normal part of life, going out to clubs and stuff. And yeah, I just had enough of it.
But
I mean, I was never, I should explain, I was never a kind of hedonistic sort of druggie. Never taken any drugs or even smoked a cigarette, which probably explains why I didn't enjoy it much. But yeah, it just wasn't for me.
But everything you do is still somehow infused with that energy. Like, it's not like you came from the world of academic, experimental electronic music. That was the background from which everything came.
Yeah, but you know, I had been to art school. I'd studied experimental film. You know, I'd encountered like Peter Gidow's work.
Right. So what's the connection between what you learned from film?
Well, in kind of experimental film, there's the kind of structuralist, materialist film movement. I guess late 60s, early 70s, which was about film is not about meaning, it's not about the communication of meaning, it's not about telling stories, it's about foregrounding its own internal means of production. And yeah, and it was like, yeah, that really makes sense.
That kind of connects back to this thing about the timeline too, because one thing that struck me, you say somewhere in the book, is that a lot of kind of latter day club music is a kind of simulacra of what happens when you're working with those early machines like the drum machines, the 808. Because you have these build-ups and these kind of crests and these movements, but they're all simulated in the timeline. They're a kind of simulation of what happens when you're in the middle of that kind of making that kind of music, and you're interacting with the machines.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm not making a value judgment about that being better or worse.
But it's a kind of, I guess I'm saying it like it's a kind of storytelling or narrative or representation of what music is like, rather than the concrete.
I think the kind of vocabulary of house and techno that was established on things like the 808, the 909, synths and stuff, you know, and the way that kind of got brought over into non-real-time timeline productions kind of did something to the character of those structures that, yeah, that it wasn't what I was interested in, basically. It felt like, you know, when you have like fake brick wallpaper over a nice concrete wall, it felt like that. Which is, you know, that's my prejudice, I guess.
And fundamentally, that has to do with the question of time, which is like a theme that runs through the book. Like the question of types of time or different experiences of time and how they relate to different descriptions of what music is or what it is to make music.
Yeah, I mean, I think the fixation on linear time is like, is a concern, I guess. But yeah, and also the view that like, that there's a beginning, a middle, and end to everything. You know, there's a reason for everything. You know, it's more to do with like a kind of linear teleology that I think is. Yeah. But what are you getting at?
Well, you talk about Husserl, don't you, a little in the book, and about how he tries to develop a philosophy of time using the analogy of music. So the model of time is actually based on a model of music. And there's a kind of reciprocal relationship between.
Yes, so in Phenomenology of Internal Time Consciousness, Husserl says, when we think of time, we can imagine a melody. But he never says what kind of, you know, he's famously vague about what that means. And he says when we listen to a melody, we don't just hear the thing that's happening, we kind of remember, I think he calls it retention, doesn't he? Remember what's just happened, and we anticipate what's about to happen, which is protension, and this threefold structure of time. Yeah, that's what he thinks, that is what he's arguing time is like. And on the surface of it, he uses the melody as a way of explaining his position on time. You know, it's like, time is like this, and think of the melody. But my problem with that is, actually, I think that his beliefs about time are already preconditioned based on his prior experiences of like things like melodies. That the stuff we presume he's talking about is stuff that's written in a certain order that's played the same more or less every time. And so yeah, it wasn't that the melody was just a convenient metaphor. It was actually part of the cognitive foundation of his thinking. Is the question I'm asking, I raised, I guess, to what extent is that the case?
And if those cognitive foundations kind of part of a very profound Western model of being in time, is there any way for us to escape them or to at least trouble them by making different kinds of music? Or are we just stuck in that?
I mean, I don't know really. Like,
we're very interested in Indian Carnatic music, which seems to have slightly different versions.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, I mean, like specifically the rhythmic stuff, which is based about it's basically like a very simple system with a few parameters that you can produce almost infinite variations, but you wouldn't ordinarily transcribe that as a linear kind of series of events.
You're very hostile to the school as well.
No, I'm not. I'm not at all, actually.
I think you'll find that you are.
Well, if you listen to Twitter, yeah, maybe. But actually, the Wire article.
Yeah.
What am I actually saying there?
I'm actually saying the score is the worst thing to happen.
And then what do I say? My favourite piece of music is something that is written in that form. You know, I'm asking a question about my own undecidability. You know, like what's going on here? And so I'm not actually opposed to the score at all. I should also explain, I do loads of kind of sort of what you might call grassroots community kind of work with kids and giving access to music and stuff. And what I encountered was that this omnipresence of this is what music is at its most profound level, and it's at its essential level, was actually a massive barrier to kids engaging with music. And all these people like, why aren't we attracting these communities? Do you know what I mean? And it was because, you know, if someone from a community that doesn't typically engage with Western classical music has access to that, that is fantastic. But it's not the only thing. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. There are lots of other things to do, and that was the question I was raising. You know, and actually, what I was trying to paraphrase was, and obviously failed miserably, was someone like Heidegger when he says the belief in there's a thing called the mind that characterizes us at our most basic level is a myth that has haunted the whole of Western civilization. And you know, I wasn't trying to be as grand as that, but it was that kind of reversal of like the thing that we think has the most value. We need to, you know, it's not everything. So yeah, I'm not against. I think I'm against the success that form has taken. Do you know what I mean?
You're against it as a universal model.
Yeah. Yeah. Like, for example, there was a study at Sheffield University that I came across, like universal transcription tool, which is essentially a linear time thing, and they've not quantized pitch or something. But actually, the fundamental thing that they never ask is representing this music as a linear transcription the best way to transcribe this music?
You increasingly work with ensembles and with musicians So how do you work with a musician without using a score? What kind of procedures, composition procedures, do you use in that situation?
Well, I want to make we should differentiate, you and I as probably the least musically knowledgeable in the room, we should make a distinction between a linear score and a procedural score. Right. You know, so there is obviously a tradition of non-linearity and indeterminacy and stuff. So when I work with people who play instruments, it's really important to give it to them, for me, to give it to them in the form that most suits them. So sometimes it might be, here's a series of notes and you just play it like that. Or sometimes it might make more sense to say, do this behavior for a few minutes, then do this behavior. But yeah, it depends on the piece, really. It depends on. I'm not really into the idea that the score is the essence of the work. You know, for me, the score is the written form. The instructions that I give to the performer are just that. You know, they're just. Yeah.
Do you find it more rewarding to work with acoustic musicians?
I mean, it is. I wish they could sound a bit more like synthesizers sometimes. Like, you know, the textural quality of an acoustic instrument is amazing, and but I still struggle because I want it to be like exactly like this. Do you know what I mean? Right. And some things just you can't be that accurate. See, I'm like super conservative, aren't I? I'm like totally OCD about me wanting to give instructions.
You have like a really strong relationship with very particular types of synthesis as well, right? Like FM synthesis seems to be something that you kind of fell in love with, never parted from.
Got stuck with.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean FM synthesis. So I grew up using analog synthesis, and then I realised, oh, if you turn the LFO really fast and modulate the frequency, you know, it produces weird squawks and stuff. And then I got really sick of like, when you've got a mono synth, basically what I ended up doing the whole time was just doing the cut-off frequency. Like, it's like, oh yeah, this is the primary way you've got of engaging with the spectral content of the whatever. And then I got a 4-operator FM synth second hand, and it was like, whoa, this is totally amazing. What you can do, you know, a very simple model that you can squash around to do lots and lots of different things.
Yeah, in some of your pieces, you know, if you had it as a score, it would be very uninformative because you just have the same pattern, very small pattern, or the same notes, but with the timbre and the spectrum kind of shifting between repetitions.
Like, yeah, basically like the frequency of a specific operator or something.
Which is also, I suppose, a kind of more subtle exploration of the kind of operation you get in house music or techno.
What do you mean?
Well, I mean, like there's certain moments in a house record that you're kind of taking and intensifying.
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested in the vocabulary of house and techno, and also the kind of sounds that evolved through that tradition, you know. And a lot of those were FM synth type sounds, like specifically the Jazzorg preset on the DX. What is it, Dx100? You know, it was there at the beginning of house and techno to some extent. I mean, yeah, I think it probably was. And then, you know, it evolved through a series. It's still used today, and you know, in really big, like, crikey, what's that artist? I've got a name. Some superstar used it, and it's like, you know, it's there all the time now. And when I met Chowning, I was like, how did you design these presets? Like, why do you know that they were like used in this context? He didn't know that. And he gave me the email address of the guy that designed the Jazzle preset. And I emailed him, I was like, oh, I've got a million questions about the Jazzle preset, and just totally blanked me.
Nobody gets emails like that every day.
Maybe these days, yeah, because it's more trendy.
We're here like in a music school. What are your thoughts about the present and the future of high culture versus low culture of music?
What do you mean by that? Like, what is low culture? And what is... Actually, one interesting thing, I remember when I was a kid, Psychic TV. I don't know if anyone's heard of Psychic TV. I was massively into Psychic TV. And they did a show here, I think. Yeah, and I got a cassette of it, and I was like, oh my God, this is like a proper university, like, you know. And for me, that was a big deal. It was like, these guys are actually doing a show here. Is someone laughing about Psychic TV? They are like utterly crap. Well, he's died now, he's dead now, isn't he? But they died about 1984, I think.
I suppose
Like
maybe rather than high culture or low culture, I'm saying formal musical education versus the kind of, I guess, like subcultural development of musical forms. Do both of them have a future, or is their future kind of now completely intertwined?
The future is to do, for me, the agenda should be how you get weirdos in places like this to do what they want to do. That's the future, I think. It's not about, you know, places that are about producing really interesting work. You know, like, we don't have to think about excellence or elitism or anything like that. It's to do interesting work. Have to be methodologically diverse, in my view.
What are the criteria for interesting work?
We don't know. But we know it's, for me, it's not just one thing.
Mm-hmm.
We might disagree about what constitutes interesting work. But I think that's about as good as we can get. Has anyone got any thoughts on improving that? No. See, they all agree with me. So yeah, for me, it's not about doing one thing a lot. It's about doing lots and lots of different stuff. And a kind of like marginal cultures, you know, peripheral activities, just the things that you know, that will only attract 3 people to a show. You know, it's that kind of.
You make quite a distinction between, or you discuss and kind of turn around the distinction between theory and practice. Kind of try to subvert it in various ways.
Well, I think all practice is a form of thinking. And I think that especially going through art school, and also seeing friends now who are struggling through art school and music school, where it's enough just to make the work, do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. We don't. And a really common one is that people try to use the work to demonstrate a theory, and that's the way you get an award, do you know what I mean? Yeah.
In the sense of like in the contemporary art world, where you have to produce a real text to explain what you're doing.
Or just like, I've got a friend who right now I know lots of friends right now struggling with PhDs, but this one in particular. And she was like, I just don't know what to write. I don't know. You know, her work was great. I don't know what to write. And I was like, well, what is your work telling you? You know, look at your practice and write about that. Don't try and use it as a vehicle just to push these, you know, to sort of, you know, you don't need the big theoretical models. I mean, I guess it's a bit weird me saying that, 'cause I really enjoy reading about that stuff. But
so I think there are two kinds of texts in the book. One of them is where you're drawing on your own experience and kind of producing a stance or a position on the basis of things that you have experienced and the position that you're in. And then there are other texts which are bringing in theoretical resources from outside. Somehow you're kind of trying to dovetail those two things.
yeah, but like, I think I'm not doing that because, crikey, I've got a book on this philosophy label and I need to kind of justify my position.
No.
I'm doing that because they actually justify my position. like, for example, if you look at DJ Pierre and the way Acid House came out of that scene and that studio session, and then you think about, like, I'm not massively into Heidegger, you know, the guy was a Nazi and stuff. But in terms of his deconstruction of like the metaphysical subject, as it's kind of enshrined by people like Descartes, he did a really good job of that, and actually provides a really good way of describing what was happening in the studio that day. Yeah.
Yeah, it's the only place where Heidegger and Acid House experience was.
Yeah.
You want to take some questions from the audience?
We've got a question from YouTube.
Yeah.
From Simon Connery, who wants to ask Mark about his process of making the compositions for drumming, group murder,
I know what you mean. They're just called drumming, I think, actually.
Okay.
Yeah.
He says that's one is particularly fun of, but I'd like to know more about the process.
So, usually when I make work, I have a really short time to do it. So I was invited to Porto to make a piece of work that was going to be shown on Friday, and I arrived on Monday, and it's like, I've got a few days to do this. So I'm always really up against deadlines and stuff. So I got in the studio with these guys, and they started to like mess around and just show me what these instruments could do. One important thing was to kind of explain to them that I didn't want any sort of gestures, you know, I didn't want any, like, it's not about kind of being emotive and stuff, like, so, and it's not about entertaining the audience, it's like, in a simple sort of way of, let's give them all these kind of easily to assimilate sort of frilly bits that they can latch onto. So I started by listening to what the instruments did, and then I kind of built these rhythmic systems based on prime numbers, so it's like non-repeating patterns. And there's about 10 different sets of stuff. I don't know why I'm looking at you, because it seems like you asked the question. And for each one, there were a set of behaviours that the performers had to do. So like, use these particular sticks in this way, do this, don't do this, or 3 of these and 1 of that. And and then we performed it and recorded it, and then I chose the ones I liked the most and made a record of it and keep performing it. So basically, it's a max patch that generates 4 channels of sound, which are rhythmic triggers that the players follow. Did that describe it all right? What's the person saying on the chat?
We'll find out about a minute
Oh, right.
as it's on a delay.
Okay.
So it's a slightly peculiar conversation to have, but if you guys talk about it.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question coming back to that, which is, it's interesting, like you were saying, you didn't want them to make any gestures or to kind of be expressive. I think when I first encountered your work, I kind of experienced it as being quite analytical and maybe like cold in a sense. I think I said before when we talked you know, I kind of imagined listening to this music and not knowing anything about you. I kind of imagined you're some like guy dressed all in black in Berlin, like who's super OCD about his equipment as well. So what was really fascinating to me doing the book, and what's still a bit puzzling as well, is that so much of what you say is connected to your family, to your life, to your history, and is very human. And yet the work is so unsentimental and, in a sense, inhuman, in the sense that it doesn't have the kind of cliche types of expression and emotion and sentiment that I guess has been traditionally
Yeah, but I think
music. So
those,
what does expression?
I think you just need to turn the contrast down. It's not like it's not there. It's just if you turn it down a bit, you know, it's there, but it's like that. You know, maybe you need to turn the contrast up to see it. But you see what I mean? It's like like I don't know.
I do remember.
I mean, I think if you're dealing with things like about the human condition and pain and suffering and all this shit and stuff, for me, you don't need to shout about it. You know, you just, it's the understatedness of it that is like what makes it more tangible, I guess.
But you do understand what you're doing as a kind of expression, but without kind of deliberately putting expression into it.
Yeah, the things like that, they're all, I would say, are all kind of sort of side effects or byproducts of just the engagement with the machine and that activity, you know, the aesthetics, the meaning, the whatever. It's not that they're not there, but the reason for that activity isn't to place them at the foreground.
Any other questions?
I read the book, I read this, so it's a bit hazy, but there's one of my favourite bits was when he was talking about your dad and his work and how, I'm getting this wrong, I seem to remember him saying like being taught how to make the tools that you use in his work first, and about how that relates to your practice. I was wondering if you could expand on that a bit, maybe. I mean, like as a listener of your work, I can hear like sound stuff which are like so clearly like, oh, it uses some synths or some patches or whatever, and then there's also like conceptual tools like band things or like kind of a certain understanding of time, which is also, like I say, that's like as well. But like, yeah, I'd love to talk a bit
Well, I think like
maybe like what's in your toolbox at the moment, which wasn't there.
Yeah, like I think what I'm kind of trying to work against is the belief that there's a thing called a tool, and the tool is just a kind of at the service of something that is higher, you know, or like whether it's meaning or communication or whatever. So the notion that there's a tool that is a kind of just a transmitter of something else is for me problematic. And I think most of the people that make music, when I talk to them, also find that equally problematic. Even though it's like one really good example is I was meeting a group of students, and I said to this group of students, how do you make music? And one guy said, I have an idea, I connect all these boxes together, then I make the, you know, like effects units and stuff. And then I make the idea, and that's how I make work. And I was like, well, how did you have the idea? Like, he said it starts with an idea in his head. I was like, how did it get in your head? And he said, I connect all these boxes together until I find something that I like, and that's where it came from. But when you're asking for a description of that, the active role of those boxes in terms of being part of the formation of what the work is kind of completely ignored. So I'm kind of like always coming up against this sort of prejudice. So I was like, how can I rewrite this sort of model and put if we want to have a thing called a tool, give it a different role. So I kind of use the tool as the starting point for everything, I guess. And then, yeah, like, it just occurred to me that there's a similarity there between, like, you know, my dad who was a steel worker, and, you know, for the first few years of his his working life, he made his own tools, and that, you know, that was how you kind of graduated into being a steelworker. And just the way I worked with Max and drum machines and stuff. In terms of what's in my toolbox, there will be things like, you know, there will be things like Heidegger. For me, Heidegger is like a tool, you know, it's like that argument is a tool. Or there'll be sounds, there'll be like bits of software, but then also the kind of processes that I implement in those softwares, if you know what I mean. And also the other tools will be things like strategies about how you work with people and how you get out of situations that aren't working, you know, and all that kind of stuff. Does that answer your question?
What might those strategies be?
Things like reducing things, basically. Like if I'm working with a performer, it's like stop doing this, stop doing this, stop doing this, and just do this. That sort of thing, I guess. Yeah. Can't think of anything else.
Connecting to another question that's come in on YouTube from, apologies for getting Julian Jask, who wants to ask specifically about 10 types of elsewhere. I point out that it feels quite different to more sort of recognisable multi-stability things. It has samples directly in it and 3 separate tracks, and specifically asking about the processes and patches related to that.
Yeah, well, that was the first record that I made under my own name as a kind of solo project, and so I'd done this project SND, which was this linear kind of techno stuff, and I'd also got this project called Shirt Tracks, which at the same time as SND, the Shirt Track stuff was out on Touch, and that was like super chaotic kind of generative stuff. And when I started to do the 10 types of elsewhere thing, it was like I was trying to bring these two different activities together. But actually, a lot of the stuff that I used in multi-stability, a lot of the pattern generating stuff started out on 10 types of elsewhere. So I think that's where I kind of developed a lot of the systems that I would use later on. Yeah. I don't know if that answers the question. Oh, we've got a minute's delay, haven't we?
Simon Connery was really happy with his lessons.
Okay, good. But yeah, really, it was me trying to work out where I was going and stuff. And also, you talk about like the work I do might be perceived to be not very emotional. If you just look back at that album, it's actually, yeah, it is quite emotional. You know, it deals with like a lot of the big stuff.
How does that work? Like dealing with it?
What do you mean?
How do you deal with questions, philosophical, existential questions in a form that's kind of abstract, and which in a sense you're distant from the medium, like you're operating through the mediation of tools?
I think all I can say is that it's not like you put that in the foreground, you know. The best way to deal with that stuff is just, you know.
It kind of emerges through your interaction with the technical environment you're in, what you choose to adopt.
Like another example, you know this artist Terry Temlitz, I don't know if any of you heard of Terry. He did a piece of work Interstices, which is this super brutal cut-up thing of like sharp sounds and stuff. And the reality, Terry probably wouldn't want me disclosing this, but the reality is, it was all to do with the kind of personal traumas, you know, the personal trauma that he was going through and stuff. It's like all of his albums have been sort of like breakup albums, you know, and they're considered to be these very dry sort of like formalist exercises, but you know, it's not that at all. Yeah.
Pushing at the back.
two questions, if I may. First, just going back to why we're talking about school being. So towards the end, like you say, the school is all about telling a lie.
About what, sorry?
You say the school is all about telling a lie.
Yeah.
And I just wondered if the implication at all, particularly given actually as well as reversion to working in timeline formats, which are comparable to story, is the implication that there's a truth in any kind of practice?
Yeah, that was an unfortunate outcome of that. That it seemed like, oh yeah, Mark's just into some sort of improv type stuff, which I kind of probably feel less at home with that than score-based stuff. To be like, yeah, I think it was unfortunate how a lot of it, like I was deliberately being really vague and provocative. You know, I was like, I have this thing called I forgot what it's called. Tactical incompleteness, I think is what I was calling it. And it's like where you leave, you don't say it fully what you want to say, basically. And sometimes that, I guess, can. It was not nice when people was. I was all right with being aligned with some kind of loony left sort of thing, but it's when people were aligning me with like Nigel Farage and stuff like that, and the whole, yeah, this is like, he's some kind of ultra populist whatever. That was not nice, you know. So, can't remember what your question was.
I think the question was like, if you're saying that in some
There's
sense
a lie,
the
is
score
there a
is
truth?
right, is there some true relation to music?
Yeah, like I said, I think that was an unfortunate outcome of me not being clear enough.
The other question, if you don't mind, was just the sort of aesthetics. Say in the context of the aesthetic, any sense of transcendence as its exact answer. Did you have, sorry, to be a bit more bit to pick out, I just wondered what we had in mind like that, if I don't specifically like Hungarian immigrants.
Well, also at the top of that bit, it says these are bullet points for discussion. So it's not like I'm nailing myself to that flag and saying yes. Like, so that section is about provoking discussion. But I think what I could say in response to that is, I met, I had an encounter with Pauline Oliveros, and who I respect loads, you know, I think the work was brilliant. And we had a big disagreement about the whole idea about deep listening. Like she was saying, what is it like to listen to something as a child? You know, like we want to get to this state of being able to listen to the world like a newborn baby, is what she said. And I was like, well, you know, listening is culturally conditioned, you know, like we have identities and stuff. And I came up with this counter mode of listening called method listening. So I was like thinking about method acting, how when you act, you kind of embody the character of the person you're trying to portray. And I got into this idea that whenever we're listening to something, we're kind of having this sort of like, it's more about kind of the kind of myths you believe about yourself and how you reinforce those, as opposed to some sort of authentic, transcendental oneness with sound, which may or may not happen, I don't know. But yeah, it was just, that bit is just about ideally starting a discussion, I think.
That kind of also gives a partial answer to the first question. There is no true way of engaging with music. There are roles that we inhabit in relation to different types of music. We say at one point, all music is ritual music. All
Yeah, I
music
mean-
has it brings with it a context within which we inhabit the type of subject in relation to it.
Yeah, I think the idea that, and this, some people believe that when you're listening to music, you're having this transcultural experience, it's not grounded in any way in the specifics of who you are, and that, music is a universal language and all this kind of stuff. There are people that still think that, and I think it's important to say the opposite of that.
Doesn't that come up in there's one particular very concrete document which is like a report that you wrote for Rotherham City Council, and they were like, how can we use music to bring all the peoples together? Music is a universal language. And I thought that was very interesting as a kind of intervention at a local level in, I suppose, the dissemination of these ideas about music to the level where they affect the deployment of this little small amount of resources that a local council might have.
Yeah.
You've been quite active on that level as well.
Yeah. I mean, especially through lockdown as well. It's like I've been forced to I've ended up getting really involved in all that. But yeah, you become aware of the barriers that there are a lot of disagreements about music, like I live in an area that a lot of my community around me is Kashmiri heritage, and the whole role that music plays in that community is completely different to, the idea like, oh, let's get together and have a party and we'll listen to this, then, those guys aren't interested in that. It's like, that's not how we do it, and ignoring those kind of cultural differences does so that it kind of, the outcome of that is kind of like, it masks our very specific cultural position. It promotes that as if it's kind of universal, so yeah, that's the issue, I think. Did you have another question, Jack?
Yeah, it basically just why do you like house music so much?
Well, I guess so. Like my kind of musical development was through synth pop, Human League and stuff like that. That was the first thing I was like really into, like soft cell and stuff like that, and then got into kind of Throbbing Gristle once they'd already disbanded. So, but throughout the 80s, kind of was into kind of quite brutal, electronic stuff. And then house and techno came along, and it's like they were the kind of fulfillment of the wish, do you know what I mean, that industrial music had kind of talked about, and it was like, wow, this is it was a really great time. And it seemed like that kind of group of largely white European the people of the British kind of industrial movement were sort of, to some extent, kind of into it, but also sort of left behind by it. So you get groups like Cabaret Voltaire, who had made some great records, and then in the late 80s they start making really crap versions of like techno and stuff. With all the friends from around the world that have been influenced by Cabaret Voltaire get involved, and they're making this awful stuff. But at the same time, you get people like the beginning of Trezor. It was people like that Cabaret Voltaire sort of scene, like people like Clock DVA, going to Berlin and Dimitri Hageman encountering techno through that generation of older artists. I'm going to get to answer the question. So like house and techno is really important to me, and I'd had this kind of weird growth through all this really quite weird music. And then when everyone got into house and techno about 1990, and hardcore started to emerge, and a lot of other stuff, it was like, this really kind of intense, brutal stuff just doesn't work for me, do you know what I mean? And I kind of encountered New York house through a DJ in Sheffield, and it was just like, wow, the way these elements fit together is just absolutely mind blowing. You know, the interlocking of all these different bits, and so yeah, I just became fixated on that, I think, and I probably still am actually. Like, that's the music I still really like. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I mean, the reason I said sort of the reason you probably asked about like the emotion in some forms of like dance music stuff, and then you mentioned dance work, and it's also seen as dry, but like I feel like New York has specifically has like a lot of like a lot of affect in it, and a lot of, and it's interesting what you just said about you being sure about this forming together, but like I'm thinking about like how can you ignore when you don't ignore like that other side of it, which is particularly through harmony and stuff. So
Yeah, but
so cheesy.
yeah, I think
you know what I mean?
it's quite linear as well, you know, and it's not like there's like this, the kind of vocal work that used to be on it, for example, tended to be chopped up, you know, so you wouldn't get these prolonged sort of like singing bits. So I think in terms of like it being kind of emotionally whatever embellished, I don't think it was to that extent, or certainly not the stuff I was listening to. But yeah.
Can I take this opportunity to ask you about some of my favourite work of yours, which is the Sensate Focus series? Because as I understand it, that's kind of drawing directly on that heritage. What is the characteristic operation of those records? What are you doing with them?
Well, what I tried to do with that was to do something entirely in a timeline, using just the pencil tool. And I decided, because I'd had this difficult issue with how you actually make working in a timeline, I decided to make it even harder by using time signatures that were like really complex, you know, like that couldn't be, so, you know, in something like Ableton or whatever, you have a grid and you can quantize things quite easily. But I was working with things like 17 divisions in a loop and interactions of weird stuff, which meant that the headache of dealing with a timeline was made like really, really utterly unpleasant. And just to kind of work with that, and that's what I did.
So you had different time signatures kind of operating against.
At some points, yeah, but generally speaking, not. But it's just that you couldn't sort of like, where the loop started and ended wasn't on a bold line. You know, it was like somewhere in between, and it's like, oh God, where's that start? And, you know.
Because I remember saying to you once, I said something about syncopation, and you kind of jumped back in horror and said, "There's no syncopation in any of my work." But some of those records have the most astonishing rhythmical.
There's only one that does that, and that's the Heat Sick remix 12-inch.
I think all of them.
No.
I mean, in what sense?
Because all the events, it's not like here's a loop with 5 things going on and 4 things going on.
Yeah.
It's all, everything, it might be a weird loop, and it might be like, the timing divisions here is like 5, and there's like 3 here, and there's 8 here. But not at any point do they kind of like work against each other. Do you see what I mean?
Right, I guess so. But it nevertheless has a rhythmical effect in the sense that of all your work, maybe it's not saying much, but it's the most danceable.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it was meant to sound good in a club, and some of them I think are all right. But yeah, like.
But that's kind of you forcing yourself to do something that you hate.
It meant that I had a different way of engaging with the materials, and that it wasn't, you know, I've worked in a timeline so much that you give me a timeline, I'll do the same thing every time, and it will be crap. So it's like, how do I stop myself being so crap?
Yes.
Make it harder for me, and then something else will emerge, and that's what happened.
Is constraint, in general, an important part of how you work?
I think we should not use the word constraint, we should use the word structure. Because I think, yeah, it's just a bit of a red herring, I think, when, like, oh, aren't we, constraint and creativity and stuff. It's like, that dichotomy is not, we can just stop talking about it, I think. Just let's use the word structure.
Does structure replace constraint and expression?
I mean, I don't even want to use those words.
Yeah.
Like, like I have nothing to express. Like for me, it is about articulation and the construction of meaning, not the expression of meaning. Or the articulation and construction of musical positions or materials, not the expression of that. You know, they're not a carrier of something that started before it. And what we're talking about is how we describe our practice. You know, it's not like that is a universe. You know, it's not like I'm saying we should all adopt the Mark Fell theory of like how we talk about. That's just how I want to talk about what I do. Question?
Yeah, just wanted to come back to what you were saying about how we should maybe rethink how we think about tools in relation to pieces, how tools can be in the fabric of a piece. But then does that mean if you're creating a new piece, you always want to rethink your tools? To be tools are things you can reuse in different works, and if you want new tools to be carried to the fabric of one piece, you feel a need to always rethink the flashes you're using. Transform them so they fit exactly work.
Well, no, I mean, sometimes like the tools I use change, but then when we think about the tools that are part of music history, for example, the keyboard, we don't need to throw the keyboard away every time we do a new composition, and actually exploring what that keyboard can do. It's going to keep us occupied for a very, very long time, you know. So for me, if we want to talk about things called tools, then I think we have to accept that they are part of our cultural systems and not some kind of detachable carriers of it, if you see what I mean. So, like for me personally, when I start a project, I don't start from scratch. You know, I've got things that I might try a bit of this, and there's this new thing that I'm working on. So and also my aesthetic concerns don't come from you know, it's not like I'm jettisoning the whole of my personal prejudices. They're all there when I work, you know. So I think for me what happened as an artist is I found something that I was interested in, and I kept going at it, you know. So it's like a kind of set of concerns or methodologies or vocabularies and stuff. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So they're not unique to a piece, but you can't just detach them from a piece.
What do you mean?
Well, you're saying you're not rethinking your practice every time you start a new work.
That's right, yeah.
Detaching it from, but it's also not treating it as something separate that once you're done using it, it's completely detached from the work.
But I'd say the practice is the thinking. That's my position. That it's not like I have a thinking about practice. The practice is the thinking. If you see what I mean. And for me, that's the kind of the most meaningful way of describing what I do. You know, I'm not trying to be abstract or weird. I'm just trying to be honest with myself. It feels like a kind of thinking what I'm doing. Is there any more questions? How much longer have we got? We can go as long as you want.
We can go to 6.
Okay.
We can carry on outside. Can I ask a question? Can I ask you to elaborate a bit on what you mean by indeterminacy? So a lot of things I think about in terms of indeterminacy are about relinquishing elements of control, about aspects of unpredictability. But you also talk about your work with agreement. There's obviously great control going on. Even the comments on the players, I quite love the attractiveness working with live players is that inherent instability that having people involved in that way. But you would like them.
Yeah, but if you have a very rigid system, and this is not a generalized comment that I think everyone should adopt, it's for me. If you have a very rigid system, the things that come out of that, for me, are interesting. But when we talk about indeterminacy in music, it's really obvious there are different kinds of indeterminacy. You know, there are things like the performer has this choice, or there's a non-linear system that isn't about choice. Do you know what I mean? Or there's something random. So indeterminacy isn't just one thing.
Does that mean that's specifically your thing?
Well, I'd kind of explore all of them, you know, and I'd explore determinacy as well, because like they're all interesting things. But generally speaking, what I like are very rigid systems, like that aren't about choice or randomness, but just absolute formal logic, and we just play those through and see what happens. That's just what I like. And basically a drum machine.
And in that sort of strange ontological uncertainty of what music is it the product that you select at the end of it, or is it the system you're putting into action? In the same way that the score is a kind of system that has a network of possibilities, but even the most traditional.
I'd say that question is a product of a teleological worldview that wants to ask us to identify what's the means and what's the outcome, or what's the vehicle and where's the value. So I think that I'm not going to ask that question because I want to stop talking about music in that teleological manner. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense.
So I don't think like what you're saying is where's the value? Where's the work? Is it the system, or is it the thing that comes out of the system?
It's about priorities, it's not so much it's that.
But do you understand the answer I'm struggling to give?
So I'm trying to think of how to reword it in a way that allows for that sense of possibilities. So it's not about biasing one over the other.
Yeah.
It's about where priorities sit.
But the distinction between those two activities, or the two categories that we're appealing to, like, is your priority here or is it here? That distinction, I would say, is part of a worldview that we're always drawn into, but I think we need to make visible and resist.
You release records, not software.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean. But again, that I would say, you make this and this. That distinction comes out of a worldview that separates this and this. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. If I'm honest, I get a kick out of making music, and I get a kick out of getting the record back through the post and it's finished. Do you know what I mean? And also it can sometimes be a trauma and not very nice, you know, especially if it's badly printed or something, or the session is difficult. But yeah, I think, have you got a question?
Following on that, would you consider selling software as well as records then? Balance or priority?
Well, actually, I do. I have got a project which is like an online kind of algorithmic system, like a shared network. So like we can all log onto this thing, and when I move a dial, it moves on everyone's screen. So I have been working on web-based systems that are like music making. Like actually, what's interesting is the funders always talk about it as if it's a tool, and it's really hard for me to say this is not a tool. This is actually a composition. And when someone's engaging with it, they're actually engaging with the composition. So yeah, I do that as well.
What was the experience like trying that out? Because that was kind of a product of lockdown, wasn't it?
Yeah,
it was a way to involve people and to do something.
It was an alternative to streaming. So in lockdown, everyone was like, "Can I do some streaming?" I really don't like the idea of streaming shows. And so, with my son Ryan Trainer, who's also a musician, we developed a way of synchronizing max patches over the internet. So we could send a max patch to Berlin and move the dials, and it changed in Berlin. And then we thought, well, this is brilliant because we can give it to like just regular people can download it. And then it was like, shit, there's all these people like asking how to install this, and this preference doesn't work and stuff. So we decided to get a web programmer to turn it into a website. What was your question?
Just what was your experience of that kind of collaboration online with lots of people using the same instrument?
It's really weird. I mean, it's kind of like, you know, there's lots of like online game type things where you can wander around shooting people in a shared online environment, but there is no musical equivalent. Like, we were really surprised that there wasn't anything like this before, like an algorithmic tool that you could all just kind of engage in. And it's kind of like nice when you just twiddling this thing and then you see someone else log on and they're moving that, and it makes really nice music.
Yeah, to answer the question as well, because it's the same thing, which is it's a second online multiplayer show with Trainer and James McCaffrey.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
So they were asking about
So it's intersymmetric.xyz, and we just did one at the Algorithmic Art Assembly last week, and we've got a few more in the pipeline, but I really wish I could say what they are, but I can't. Yeah.
So does it remain a markdown composition? Whatever
Yeah,
people do?
that's why I did it. So it's like whenever they are performing it, they're performing. I use that legal framework to protect it, basically, because otherwise there's this grey area of like, if it's a tool, then two people working in it are collaborating and have mutual ownership over it. If it's a composition, then the two people collaborating in it are merely performers of that composition. And legally, that's how we framed it. Not that it's made any difference to us. Any more questions? Have you got one, Jan? You must be thinking of something. You must be thinking, Mark is so full of shit.
No, I never think that, Mark. I was interested when you talk about materialist filmmaking, because I associate that with kind of certain period where Russian materialist, or Soviet filmmaking, which is where the materials are very evident or stripped back or very physical and engagement with film. And I just wonder that link between materialist art practices and materialism as sort of as a philosophical way of viewing the world. I'm just wondering if you would say that there's some commitment to materialism as a worldview that informs your practice. In the way that perhaps you could say that Marxist materialism likely had an underlying philosophy for Russian filmmakers.
I don't really know what you mean. Like, what are you asking me? I'm not, that's not a trick question, I'm genuinely confused. Like, is materialism?
Well, yeah, so a lot of the things you've been talking about have been sort of seem to me, you could understand them as a suspicion of a narrative which is about music as a carrier of transcendent meaning. And I understand that, where that suspicion comes from. So I guess I'm asking the other question, which is that an understanding of the world which is that it entirely consists of a physicalist or a materialist. It's all about matter, in other words. The existence of any kind of idea of transcendence per se is important to you as a philosophical commitment.
I think operating in like an art world and a music world context, it's so kind of, the image is about transcendence, ideas about transcendence and like universality and authenticity and stuff is so kind of, it's so saturated that I think having a simplistic attitude of just rejecting that is probably something that I do. Yeah.
I think there's also a more considered position in terms of materialism and the concerns with class raised in the book in relation to the art world and to the kind of spaces that you inhabit now as an artist, insofar as that transcendence is supported from below by a kind of strata of workers who are not seen in the museum, in the venue, and they're the people who do all the technical stuff, which is considered not to be a part of art because it's dealing with the tools or the equipment. So there's a kind of social analogy, if you like, with your thinking, the involvement of the technical environment, of tools and composition. But that has to be exposed as well. Like the people who work behind the seamless white interior of the museum, like making everything actually function.
Yeah, and if you look in the music, like recently, I didn't study music technology because you couldn't study music technology when I was at university. So, and if you wanted to study music technology, you had to go through the traditional music education, which I couldn't do because I couldn't play anything. And then you would be studying like French electroacoustic music and stuff like that. There was no way to study like anything other than that. But with the advent of music technology programs, the dichotomy between that and traditional music programs, like Georgina Bourne's work, really highlights how traditional music courses tend to be like white, relatively middle class, privileged kids, and the music technology courses are the kind of working class and culturally diverse people. And her concern is like, to what extent is that system actually sustaining those imbalances? So here's a school that's kind of educating the people that will then facilitate the work of these other people. They'll be the sound recordists for the people who do this, and that's not a good situation, I think.
I wonder if that situation would go full circle, actually. One becomes so niche that they require a different set of professional skills to exist. And then it starts to get very creative in terms of production, energy, actually, that ultimately starting to sort of happening in social stuff, professional sense. But that's a sort of
Was your own experience of education marred or affected by class issues, would you say?
Well, I was lucky. I went to a really brilliant art school in Sheffield that was amazing, and they were all like super radical, like kind of really influenced by a lot of the work at Pavilion, Griselda Pollock and feminist theory of art practice. So I was kind of lucky in that I was taught by people who were kind of, aware of those issues and actively dealing with them in the old polys, I think, were kind of quite radical in that respect.
Which doesn't really exist anymore.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to have changed. Like art education seems to have changed quite dramatically from that. Where the art school was about being super radical, and doing mental stuff and challenging things. It's like it all seems to have got a little bit kind of lifestyle.
Have any more questions online?
No.
We've bored everyone into submission.
We have to end this now.
Okay, yeah.
Do you want to have a final word?
I can't think of anything. You have the final word this time. Robin's final word.
Well, what did you get out of doing this book most of all? What did it?
You know what? I got to be able to stop worrying about it. All that was like going on in my head, and it's like, thank God for that. I can actually it's there now. I can move on. So that's what.
Do you consult it sometimes?
No, but
Just to
I
think?
look at it sometimes. I think it's quite a
To remember
nice
what you
thing
think.
just to, yeah, it's a nice thing just to leaf through, I think.
Hopefully it becomes the tool for other people in their practice as well.
It got a fantastic review in The Wire. Did you see the review in The Wire? I was like gobsmacked. It's the best review I've ever had for anything.
Yeah, well, thanks a lot for
Thanks,
the
Robin.
conversation. Thanks for the questions, everyone.
Yeah, thanks for coming.
Robin, thank you so much for being here today. It's hugely appreciated.
It's nice to get over here finally, actually.
Yeah, it's brilliant. It's very satisfying. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.